Hello. Thanks very much for coming. This is obviously the last presentation before the Friday night. So what they say, a quick game is a good game. And what I'd like to do to start with is, I'm here to present some of Dr. Jonathan Leader's work on the recovery, and he really has pioneered a lot of the recovery work we do in Olympic sport. And consequently, some of the stuff which is now pervading and driving the recovery strategies forward across the kind of elite sport community and around the world. I wanted to share a quick, brief story with you beforehand about some of my personal experiences with recovery, and it's centered around a recent tournament. So this is from a slightly different presentation, but I thought it was a story worth telling because it might have some implications of how you prepare your dancers for the demands that they face and the influence that can have on recovery. So I want to show you what hockey looks like quickly. I work with the national hockey team. It's a fast, explosive game. We tend to train for about 20 hours a week. 20 to 30 hours a week, depending on how kind we're feeling. And the tournaments are 8 matches in 13 days. Good. So there you've got a bit of an idea. So there's a lot of mechanical stress that's placed through the athlete's body on a daily basis. So within this kind of short period of time, they have an enormous amount of mechanical stress placed through them. And the reason why I thought this is kind of relevant, because it's similar with some of the performers that you're going to be working with, when they have to train day in, day out, they have to rehearse day in, day out, then they have to go and do a show, sometimes multiple shows within a day and throughout extended periods of time. So the mechanical stress that goes through your dancers' bodies is in no way similar to what we have as elite athletes, but we can certainly say the mechanical demand is high. You can see here just some metrics just in terms of the amount of sprints and activities that you're probably not that interested in, but they have to do a lot. I'll take you through this here. What I wanted to do was measure their tournament durability. So when we're talking about recovery, I wanted to flip that and think about preparation. So if we want to win an Olympic medal, particularly a gold medal at the Olympics, we need to win 8 matches within a 13-day period when the players are having to make sort of several sprints a minute repeatedly for an hour. Again, high mechanical demand, similar to some of the situations that you guys are going to face. So my focus was really on tournament durability and understand what it looked like to see what a durable hockey player looked like. In the same way, so rather than looking at recovery as how can we help people recover between matches, it's like, what's the physical profile of an athlete, or we could think of as a dancer, that is physically capable of tolerating that without having to use any aggressive recovery interventions. So the question that I had in my mind was how the neuromuscular system, or how the autonomic nervous system was influenced by both the tournament, how strong players were, and their nutrition. So some of the fundamentals that when we think about recovery, we're going to talk about some of the kind of sexier stuff like ice baths and compression garments, but some of the fundamentals and how well they influence how capable athletes are recovering. Every single day, we measured how much force they could produce on a force plate. We also measured their heart rate during a stress test. So they jogged for 5 minutes and we measured what their heart rate response was. So we had an indication of what their muscles were capable of doing and what their autonomic systems were capable of delivering on a daily basis. And we also were able to measure their work demand on a day-by-day basis within the match. Essentially, we found 2 things. One of the 2 things which were sensitive to change. One was their working heart rate. So essentially, we found that if they had to do a double header, like 2 matches in a row, they had a lot of stress placed to their body, it would have an impact and an influence on their autonomic function. And secondly, their impact force, so how hard they hit the force plate. So when the players fatigued, they had to do lots of work. Essentially, the next day they would, instead of when they landing nice and softly, they would slam into the floor. And I also wonder how kind of relevant that is for the communities that you work with as well. Lots of stress, day-by-day basis. what's happening to their internal workings, what's happening to their autonomic systems, and then what's happening to their neuromuscular function, what's happening to their ability when they land from a jump, how able are they to produce force to stop themselves slamming into the floor and put themselves at risk of injury. These are two, for me, really, really interesting slides. I don't want to kind of bore anyone with some of the statistical methods that we use, but essentially what we found is if you look at the graph on the left-hand side here, what we've got, I split the groups into stronger athletes and weaker athletes. So the stronger ones are the ones who could squat over 1.7 times their body weight. And they're also the ones who could absorb, when we measured them on a force plate, they could absorb a lot of force and a lot of power. They were strong, resilient girls. And then we've got the weaker ones as well on the other side. And those are ones who weren't able to do that type of work. What we also measured was within the game how many times they had to decelerate. So how many times they had to really put the brakes on and stop really, really hard. And essentially what we found was if there was more decelerations within the game, so they had to do a lot of eccentric loading throughout the game, all of them increased their impact force the next day. So everyone just slammed into the floor a little bit harder the next day. However, if you were weaker, you went in twice as hard. So in terms of recovery, one of the most important things, this is the biggest message for me, was if we want to help our players recover between matches, we needed to make them a little bit stronger. So stronger players recovered better than the weaker ones. So when we think of recovery strategies, I'm not also thinking about what's happening day to day. I'm thinking about what the preparation we can do to make sure these players can handle the tournament demands. And the other thing was carbohydrate intake as well. We split it into stronger and weaker, but essentially what we found was, again, change in neuromuscular function. We found that the people who took a low carbohydrate diet during periods of intense competition were the ones who had a bigger change in neuromuscular function. Essentially, when they landed, when they hit the floor, they slammed in even harder as well. So we can think of that in terms of injury risk. We can think about that in terms of capability to be aesthetically beautiful in the next performance. But essentially, if you're not strong and you're not eating a high carbohydrate, if you're restricting your carbohydrate intake, then you're not giving your body the best ability or best possibility of recovering properly. And for me, this was the most interesting and sort of fundamental thing that influenced what I thought about recovery. And when I speak to just a quick other one, fitness as well. Exactly the same story for fitness. Fitter players recovered better than less fit players. And I wanted to share this story. With you now. Essentially this. If we want to be tournament durable, we want to help our players recover. We need to be stronger, we need to be fitter, and we need to make sure we're not restricting our carbohydrate intake because we think it's going to make ourselves look better. And for me, that was, again, I'm going to go through Jonathan's slides now, but for me, that was one of the most fundamental shifts I had in thinking about recovery. So I wanted to share that story with you. Recovery isn't just about what happens on a day-to-day basis. It's about, fundamentally, it's about how you're preparing before you're going into those periods of high stress. So when we start a recovery, and we start just from a theoretical perspective, where does recovery fit in? Like what is recovery and when does it actually happen? So whenever you do some sort of training or you do some sort of, your body's placed through some sort of physical or physiological stress, there's initially a decrease in performance, you fatigue, and there's a cycle that takes place which allows you to recover, and you supercompensate. Your body allows you to do more work than previously takes place. And then you're hopefully fitter, stronger, better able to do the things that you did last time. So the question is, why is recovery important for dancers? Approximately there's 3 performances a week for some different types of dancers. I believe this is, I'm not quite sure what population this information's from, but you're approximately training for 53 hours, where you're engaging in activity for 53 hours. Which is about twice the amount of the Olympic athletes that we work with, and 6 days a week. And of course, you're jumping and landing to over 200 times per class. And if we think about the previous information that are collected, We see that people who start to fatigue earlier, the ones who are the ones who are weaker, and the ones who don't have quite as good diet, are the ones who are just going to keep hitting the floor harder and harder and increase their risk of getting injured. So this idea here is that we can try and increase the chance of, certainly from an athletic performance perspective, we can try and increase the chances of optimal performance by avoiding injury and illness, by speeding up the recovery of the legs themselves and making sure the legs are more capable of delivering the work demand, and increasing the perceptionness of readiness and freshness. And I think that's so important with all the athletes that we work with, just that feeling of, yeah, my body feels good, it's ready to do the things that it's capable of doing. So recovery becomes really important from those key concepts there, but ultimately to try and increase the chances of optimal performance. The basic forms of recovery, and hopefully my little story beforehand provided some evidence to support some of this as well. There's 3 fundamental things that we can't even dream to think of putting any other strategy in place unless we're getting enough sleep, we're eating appropriately, and we're getting actual rest time in. We're going to talk about, and Jonathan's got some research which he's conducted, which I'm going to show to you about more the sleep aspects, because that's within the Olympic sport. That's something that's taking a large amount of our time, a large amount of our focus and thinking at the moment. Sleep's really important for a few reasons. Firstly, is for our general energy levels on a day-by-day basis, making sure that we're rested enough to be able to perform the tasks that we have to do, and to restore and preserve our immune function. If we're ill, we can't perform optimally, or we can't even go out there and do the stuff we want to do. From a nutrition perspective, we think of, again, within an Olympic environment, we think of things in three areas. First of all, refueling, making sure that once you've undertaken a heavy work demand, you're taking enough energy to make sure that you've replenished the energy that you've used, and hopefully the data beforehand, which I showed, demonstrated that. If you're having a low carbohydrate diet consistently, you're quite simply not taking in the right amount of energy to help you recover from the demands that are being placed through your body. Rehydration is important, again, really important for mostly immune function, but again, maintaining a homeostatic environment, and then obviously repair, so making sure you're taking your protein in as well. And then rest. I mean, one of the things that we can tell you a little anecdote here. We have actigraphy that we put on. It was actually the bobsleigh team that we were working with at the time, and we had this actigraph watches on. And essentially, what we did, we wanted to see how much time they were like sleeping and how much time they were awake and training. But what we didn't find was that we couldn't understand it. They were training really, really hard, and then they'd kind of go to bed and they'd sleep. But throughout the entire day, their resting levels of activity were kind of high and sustained throughout. And the guys' performances were just decreasing. We couldn't work out why. And when we looked at it, they were going out shopping, or they're going to the golf range, or they were just doing loads of different things which they were on their feet the entire day. And because basically they were bored. So instead of resting properly, they were bored, they'd be up on their feet, so they'd go and do something active like go shopping. And it just meant that they weren't giving their bodies the physical capability of resting and to recover. So when we presented them with that information, it meant they were bored, they got really good at video games, but we were able to get some of the adaptations that we were looking for with them. That's a message from Jonathan here. That was Jonathan, by the way, when he was... No, only joking. So this is some research that he's pulled out for you guys, and it was looking at the sleep quality in professional dancers. So they were looking at basically what sort of quality of sleep do ballerinas get before they go into major... I don't want to keep... You're going to have to excuse me for my vernacular, but if I say major periods of competition or training, please try and, put that into your own language. And this is really, really common with athletes as well, so there are similarities here. The main findings were that the sleep duration was significantly lower than a normal population. And if you think of the normal population and the physical demands of everybody going about their daily business compared to an elite dancer, And then we think of how much rest and recovery they need to be able to adapt from that and recover, be able to deliver the next day. These elite ballerinas were getting less sleep than the normal population. And of course, during periods of stress, they become more sleep deprived and had a huge impact on their immune function as well. Again, and this is the research I think that Jonathan himself did on the Olympic athletes versus the normal population. And essentially what they found was that the athletes, because sleep is perceived to be so important, athletes then said, right, we're going to spend more time in bed. So they get to bed earlier, they still have to wake up earlier. But what ended up happening was take longer to fall asleep than the normal population. And they had poorer sleep quality, probably because they had sore muscles, or they, and obviously that sort of that swelling of the muscles onto the pressure sensors, so your nociceptors within the muscles, means that there's a sort of pain sensation, increases discomfort, reduces a likelihood of high quality sleep. And then what ended up happening, although they were in bed for longer, that you ended up having less sleep. So there's a real parallel with the dance community from terms of total sleep duration and the total physical demand. And obviously this is the impact it can have. I should have really kind of cleared some of these slides out before I went in. No, he really These, can you guys read that okay? No, not really. I'm not sure if anybody's on Twitter. Is anybody on Twitter? Yeah, everybody. If you guys are really interested in, these are essentially the same, we stole all of our information from Twitter in Olympic sport. But this guy here, at YLM Sport Science, is a guy called Lima, and he's doing a lot of research in sleep and on recovery in elite athletes. He's from France. And if you go onto his Twitter feed, you can go to his website and find some of the infographics. He produces these fantastic infographics, which basically dissects and disseminates all of the latest research on lots of different areas related to athletic recovery and performance. And these, he's put together a mini guide on how to improve sleep. And this has become a real kind of sticking point for us. And we measure and monitor the sleep. Interestingly enough, within our group as well, the stronger girls are the ones that tend to sleep better, although I haven't tried to milk it that much with them. But that we generally are finding the guys who are better athletically prepared are the ones who are able to sleep better because essentially there's less damage and less stress going through their body than the ones who are less prepared. Yeah, there are kind of 5 things which we say are really, really important, if you guys can't read that, to maintaining or getting high quality sleep. Keeping a regular schedule is really important. Trying to go to sleep at the same time, having the same pre-bed habits are important. Eating, drinking correctly, so making sure that you're not taking high energy foods in before you go to sleep, and reducing the fat intake before you go to sleep. And they've also, there's some evidence out there that taking additional protein before you fall asleep as well can increase sleep quality, and obviously can help muscles repair while you're sleeping. On this thing it says, sort of very flippantly, get anxiety and stress in check, which we know is a lot harder to do than simply saying we're going to get it in check. Making your bedroom sleep friendly. So making sure the bedroom's not too hot is a really important one. Make sure there's cool, fresh air going through the bedroom. Making sure things like you've got clean linen, again, really, really important things we stress with our athletes. You wouldn't believe how many of them don't change the bed that particularly regularly. And making sure the mattress is flipped and stuff like that. So there's a constant level of comfort that they can expect. And of course, you guys will tour as well. And trying to transfer that sleep environment into when you're going into hotels and you're touring is very important. And the other tip is creating a relaxing bedtime routine, which I think is quite aligned with keeping the regular schedule. I think we've spoken enough about the nutritional components here, and hopefully the kind of little story I told at the start will support some of that as well. But essentially, one of the things you're doing, there's some great research by Mike Gleason out there as well, looking at immunosuppression associated with lack of carbohydrate. So not only if you're not taking enough carbohydrate immediately post a physically demanding activity, like a dance show, for example, you're not only reducing your muscles' ability to recover, but what you're also doing is putting your body into a state of immunosuppression, increase the chances of you getting ill, which is kind of no one wants that, because you won't be able to get out there and do the thing that you're paid to do. I think there's a great story. There it is, yeah. So this is Jonathan's much better story with Chris Hoy rather than the bobsleigh team. But essentially, when you've got very, very high work volumes, sometimes people get really, really bored. And I think that some of the work that we do as elite athletes and as well as elite dancers can end up being fairly monotonous. And it's about making sure that from a recovery perspective, that the people that you're working with are allowed to get enough time with their feet up, but that, again, they're not getting bored as well. So one of the big problems that we have is, again, athletes, they train hard, it's monotonous. You guys, you'll practice your dance routines, you'll go and do your classes, you go and perform, it's monotonous, it's the same thing day in, day out. People are going to, the people that you work with are going to get bored, so they want to go and do stuff, but equally, if they're on their feet and doing stuff, they're potentially compromising their recovery. So it's a real dichotomy that you guys have got to work with, the dancers that you work with face. So we've gone through some of the basics, and I've managed to pitch in how important I think it is to be strong and fit and well prepared and eat well. But now we can go through some of the more kind of novel interventions which are involved in elite sport. Now I'm just wondering, just as a show of hands, does anyone here after heavy periods of performance use ice baths? Of course, that's fairly well done. What about cryotherapy? Going into the cryo chamber? Oh wow, brave souls. And foam rolling and massage? Fantastic, everyone's like, it's a roll, good stuff. And how about any of the neuromuscular stimulation? A little bit. I've seen quite a few people with their hands up every single time, so you guys clearly think that how you recover is that the additional interventions you put in place are really important. And I really, really would stress that Nick Grantham, who you've seen talk today as well, he came up with a recovery pyramid, and essentially 80% of your recovery takes place within the eating, the sleeping and resting, and you literally cannot get away from that. And I would say as well, I would add to that as well, being well prepared as well. So if you've got those kind of 4 things in place, then you're increasing your capability to recover. And one of the things that we look at with the groups that we work with is saying, yeah, a lot of them come to us and go, we need more massage. Can we get ice baths? Can we get the neuromuscular stimulation? And it's like, well, how many hours have you slept? Are you hydrated? Have you eaten enough? Some of the more basic questions there, which no one likes to answer because everyone wants a rub and then everyone wants a rub down and wants to make their bodies feel good. But by taking some proactive strategies, you can really do a lot of that work yourself. So now I'm going to talk about some of the science and efficacy of some of these more sort of aggressive strategies around high periods of work. So this was part of Jonathan's PhD research, and I'd certainly encourage you to, for the scientists in the room, I'd certainly encourage you to have a good read of it. He analysed 14 studies that were in place at the particular point in time on cold water immersion with an N size of 239, so large numbers of people. They looked at the changes in muscle strength, muscle power, creatine kinase and DOMS associated with it. Right, and there you can see the results, obviously. Basically, for those who aren't familiar with this type of review process, basically any data point that is towards this side favours the intervention group, and any research which is that side of the line favours a control group, and the black lines are the error bars there as well. So you can see across all of the pieces of research that was done on cold water immersion, so your kind of ice bath type stuff, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 which favoured cold water immersion. And you can even see the error bars there are quite large as well. Well, the rest of them, I'll let you guys count them out yourselves, either favoured the control or no difference whatsoever in terms of either changes in creatine kinase, which is a measure of muscle damage, symptoms of muscle soreness, muscle strength or muscle power. So there's certainly an argument there that the jury is kind of still out. But one of the big things about it is perception. I know that people who throw their hands up, getting into an ice bath is not a pleasant activity. So if you stuck your hand up and said, oh yeah, I do use ice baths, then you probably do it for a bloody good reason and that you think it works. And that is such an important component to it as well. So from a scientific perspective, the jury's still out, you could argue, but from a practical and applied perspective, if people feel that it works for them, then it's potentially a good thing to do for them. There's kind of one caveat to that, and there's large evidence around heavy periods of training when we're trying to facilitate an adaptive response. So in particular when we're doing strength training or when you want your dancers to become better at something, particularly when you want to become more powerful, it's probably not a good idea to use your ice baths around then because essentially you're blunting the inflammatory response within the muscle, which facilitates protein synthesis and the muscles getting stronger and more powerful. So within heavy periods of work where you're just trying to get through it, and if you guys feel better, and the guys you're working with feel better doing it, it's a great idea. However, if you're trying to get better at something, and particularly involves high power activities, then I probably wouldn't do it around then because it could blunt some of the adaptive responses which you're trying to achieve with all that training. There is also some evidence, and there's less evidence and it's more thought around cold water immersion prior to sleep. So typically people will say have a hot bath, but what you can do is, particularly if you get into something very, very cold, and I think this could be some of the adaptive responses around cryotherapy, so getting into like a minus 140 degree chamber, it gives you a huge, which one is it? It's a huge sympathetic drive. So by having this amazing cold water immersion, it gives you a massive sympathetic drive, which will stimulate sleep cycles. So if you get into a cold, very, very cold ice bath, within about an hour of falling asleep, if it's cold enough and you're in there for about 10 minutes, it can actually help you sleep better because of the stimulation you get into the sympathetic system. And again, the guidelines are around 10 to 15 degrees for 10 to 15 minutes. Again, the ice baths don't need to be as cold as you think. Sort of 10 to 15 degrees is kind of around tap temperature on a particularly cold day in Birmingham. So how about compression? Any of you guys walk around looking like this? I hope not. Again, part of Jonathan's research, he looked at compression garments and recovery from, he did exactly the same thing, so I can't quite remember whether you're going to see another, there we go. Thankfully, you're not going to see one of those other slides as well there. The effectiveness of compression. Some of the things to consider are how well they fit, the pressure that they're actually going to give you. So sometimes if you get, what you need is to stimulate is about, I think it's about 20 millimeters of mercury above systolic pressure around the ankle, which is quite easy to deliver with some of the compression garments. But obviously if people have got bigger legs, their legs stretch, the amount of compression that's higher up the leg will be less. So are you actually getting the compressive effect higher up the legs? And what about the foot as well? It's really difficult to model a compression garment around the foot to be able to stimulate the venous flow. So what you're trying to do through compression, is stimulate venous return. So make sure that you're not getting any blood pooling. You're continually seeping the muscle in a kind of nutrient-rich environment and reducing the toxins. And so it's really, really important to make sure it's an appropriate fit. And I think that's one of the things that people get unstuck with compression garments. They put the things on and they're kind of too loose. So again, this is an interesting study on foam rolling. So we had quite a lot of people who stuck their hands up for foam rolling and whether it helps or not. One of the most important findings of this research was that, again, it attenuated people's perceptions of muscle soreness. Did it actually have an impact on physical function the next day? So did it actually help you recover, help your muscles recover? No. But it certainly had an impact on people's perceptions, again, which is just as important. And I think that the perception of muscle soreness again could be due to the nociceptors as well and pain receptors. So essentially, you're getting a kind of higher stimulus through there and cooling down some of the and sort of changing the afferent input. This is something that the muscle stimulation is something that I'm absolutely fascinated by. Actually, so it's basically some of these devices here are able to stimulate the smooth tissue within your body. So not necessarily the muscle itself, but the venous system. So what you're actually doing, if you're saying, well, one of the reasons why I want to do cold water immersion, or one of the reasons I want to do compression, is to try and increase venous return and to try and get rid of the toxins away from the site that's working, trying to kind of diffuse that and make sure there's more oxygen and a nutrient-rich environment going to the muscle itself that's been working. That's one of the reasons why you do all this recovery, active recovery, etc. Now, what you can do is passively use neuromuscular stimulation. And what you're able to do is stimulate the venous, the venous return system, so the smooth muscle, and not stimulate contractile muscle. So essentially, what you're doing is not stimulating the contractile muscle means that you're not putting any more fatigue through it, but by stimulating venous return, you're able to get more blood flow to the area. And the Gecko device, which is the one on your far left there, actually stimulates the peroneal nerve, so you get a kind of little twitch in your foot when you do it. So I'm a bit of a fan, personally I'm a bit of a fan of this one if we think blood flow is important, because what you're getting is blood flow for free, basically, and you can keep these things on for a long period of time. Active recovery. Does anyone here or any of get their dancers to, when they've finished a performance, go and do some sort of light exercise or stretching activities? Okay, so not many. And this is a really common one in sport. Basically, you'll see every single team, every single athlete, as soon as they finish, sort of go for a little bit of a jog, have a bit of a sort of stretch, and actually more than often have a bit of a chat with each other. The evidence to support it are actually more surrounding in really, really intense exercise. So if you're doing something which is maximal, doing an active recovery immediately after something maximally demanding will increase your rate of recovery. And again, trying to keep your feet off, trying to keep your weight off your feet is important with that one, rather than taking more impact force. If it's not done around something which is physiologically maximally demanding, again, it feels good, but there's no real evidence to support its efficacy. I think that one of the things that Jonathan was trying to ask here is, like, why bother doing all this stuff? Right? So what we've said is, like, everyone here has put their hand up for some sort of aggressive recovery intervention. There's very, very limited scientific evidence to support a lot of it, so why bother doing it? Essentially, it's perception, and I think that's hugely important. If you've got sore, tired legs, you want to try and do something active to try and reduce those perceptions of fatigue. And I really agree with what he's put up here, that if you are feeling more fatigued, it's got in your head, you're not going to be able to deliver the things that you want to do. It might well increase your risk of getting injured, and ultimately it can reduce your performance potential as well. And I think that when I had a chat with Jonathan about this is something that he really wanted to kind of stress, is the more like the deterministic orientated thinking. So particularly if you consider the different recovery strategies that you can put in place, all will have a slightly different benefit from both a potential benefit from a physical perspective, and different benefit on an inter-individual basis from a psychological perspective. He was trying to really get across to you guys that So I'm trying to get across to you guys. What is it that that individual person is doing within a first show and a double show day, or even if they've got extended practices on the day of a show, that can have an impact on people's ability to perform in the second show? So, for example, on the day of a really demanding show in the evening, are you doing hundreds of jumps and landing? Are you giving the dancers heavy eccentric loads? And if you are, what impact could that possibly have on what they've got to do later on that day? Therefore, what interventions could you put in place to help them? And these are the things that you could possibly consider. The first thing to consider is time available. And this is sort of, again, Jonathan being a world expert as well and collaborating with lots of people around the world, these are the kind of conclusions that he's come to. And these are sort of definitely the things that I've nicked from him. So hopefully you can steal them from me, and which I've stolen from him, which he stole from other people, that you can use yourself. This is his kind of thought process with it. First and foremost, what's your time availability? Have you got enough time to deliver a recovery, to deliver anything recovery? And if you have a recovery mindset, if you've got, and I think a recovery mindset, you've got to think not just the micro, what's happening today, you've got to think what's happening within the month or with the period of shows that we've got going on and what we're planning for. So having recovery at the forefront of your mind is really important. What time is available will dictate a lot of the strategies you can use. Firstly, like we said, sleep is so important for both cognitive function and physical function. You know, kind of successively and consecutively, have the people you work with been sleeping poorly? Have you asked them how well they're sleeping? And they are sleeping poorly. Is there time to have a power nap, or is there time to even have a caffeine nap? And a caffeine nap is when it takes about 20 to 30 minutes before the impact of caffeine to really kick in. So could you take some caffeine down through like a coffee, fall asleep for 20 minutes, and then wake up and you're fully charged, ready to go? Are you dehydrated? Have you got your body's homeostatic environment in the right possible place to be able to accommodate high levels of performance and to recover from the work that you've just done? And if not, maybe you need to look at electrolyte solutions or work with nutritionists to support that. Are the people that you're working with getting chronically dehydrated throughout successive shows? And have you asked them that question? If we think this is so fundamental to recovery, how many times have we asked that question? Have you slept? Are you hydrated? What have the people you've been working with been eating? Have you asked them how much? Have you watched them what they're eating? Are they just eating salads? Are they eating anything at all? When was the last time you saw, if you know that they've got a physically very, very demanding period of time or a day, when was the last time you saw them eating an adequate amount of carbohydrate, either before their performance or afterwards? Is the work that they're doing damaging towards their muscles? You know, have they got loads of jumps in there? Have you just started to introduce strength training? And if so, is there a readily available protein source that they can take on to ensure that their muscles can adapt, and to ensure their muscles can adapt to that, but also to prevent them getting sore? And there is evidence to suggest that taking protein, again, before you go to bed and immediately post heavy training, can reduce symptoms of muscle soreness. Do the people you work with, do their legs tighten up? Do they feel like they're getting seized up? Do you see them stretching all the time? Do you see them loosening up? Are they constantly after rub downs? And if that's the case, do they engage in an active recovery immediately after their intense exercise? Are their muscles sore? Do you put them into cold water afterwards? Do they go and engage in that? Because, you know, frankly speaking, it might not have a large impact from a physical perspective, but if that makes them feel better, it will have an impact. I don't think you'd be able to necessarily tell if somebody's legs are swollen unless they've been on a kind of long-haul flight. But if you think that if their muscles are sore, or they have been doing heavily demanding work where they're likely to get muscle damage, then there will be micro-swelling within the tissues. So you have to consider some compression from that perspective as well. This is certainly the model that we use in our elite sport environment, but we have kind of had the time to do it though. So we have our match. Afterwards, we do an active recovery. We take on fuel and we rehydrate immediately post. We then get them into an ice bath. We take them back to the hotel. They get another feed in. They're in the compression garments or their muscle stimulation, and then they're sleeping. This might not be practical for your guys or the people that you're working with, which is why I'd certainly, in the discussion that Jonathan and I had said as well, like, think recovery. Consider these things. Ask the right questions which are orientated to the things which will help the people you're working with recover. This is some of the, I'm going to gloss through this because this is the work I presented at the start, but essentially the guys that you're working with will have to do lots of eccentric muscle actions. They're going to have heavy loads placed through their legs. Stronger, fitter athletes, stronger, fitter dancers with high carbohydrate intake are more likely to be able to tolerate that. And again, something we've spoken about, something that I've spoken about at length already, that it is a really individual thing. And the very fact that there's no one, when I asked the question, no one there wasn't everybody stuck their hand up and said, we all do this because we all value it as important. Everyone had their hand up for something slightly different. And I think the more you can get to know the people that you're working with, and the more you can ask them questions around, how are you sleeping? Are you hydrated? Observe their diet. What's their diet like? Think to yourself, are they strong enough to be able to handle this? What does their day look like? Have they got enough time to put recovery strategies in? And you can look at that from your group perspective, but also from an individual perspective as well. I think this was from the Journal of Dance Medicine and Science, and it was more looking at the working day. And I think this is really reinforcing the point about looking at the day that you've got ahead of you and planning in what you're going to do within your rest time. Within your rest time, what do? You putting your feet up and sleeping and just like kind of waiting to the next one? Have you got media things that you need to take care of? Have you got people harassing you the whole time? Are people just on their phone? Are they sleeping at all? So actually thinking recovery when you're planning the day is just as important as thinking work when you're planning the day. Again, and to conclude here, what I'd like to put across is that exactly what we just said before. Planning recovery is just as important as planning your work times, and considering recovering professionally. Consider recovery part of what it is to be a professional dancer, and just taking and adopting that mindset will already help you ask some of the questions, and some of the more basic questions which will have the larger difference as well, which are orientated towards helping you recover from the work that you're doing and to be able to perform better successively. And that's it from me, and I'd like to open this up to any questions.